Have you ever been part of a project, maybe at your company, or even organizing some kind of large-scale community initiative where every single box on the checklist was ticked?
Oh, I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right. I mean, every quote-unquote deliverable was met perfectly on time. The project management spreadsheets were just, completely green.
A project manager's absolute dream.
Exactly. And yet, when you finally step back to look at the finished product, the whole thing still somehow feels like a massive failure.
Yeah, it is a surprisingly common and frankly deeply frustrating experience for basically anyone who works on a team.
It really is.
You followed the map perfectly, you hit every milestone, but you ended up in completely the wrong destination. The users are confused by it, the team is just completely burned out, and honestly, nobody wants to look at the underlying work ever again.
That is the exact paradox we are looking at today. This
Yeah.
bizarre phenomenon where technical success somehow equals practical failure.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
So to guide us through this, we are using a single, incredibly insightful piece of source material. It's an essay from March 2026 titled Partnership Before Delivery, Building Value Together Over Time.
And it's written by Tobias Reidenhag, right?
Yep, Tobias Reidenhag. He leads design at Intunio, which is this Swedish UX design and development studio that's really known for tackling complex digital products.
They do some fascinating work.
They really do. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore Intunio's core philosophy.
Which is pretty radical, honestly.
Very much so. They're arguing that the traditional client-supplier relationship is just fundamentally broken for long-term projects, and that shifting to a true partnership model is really the only way to build things that actually last.
And, understanding that shift is critical for you right now, regardless of your specific industry.
Oh, totally. It's universal.
Because whether you are building complex software architecture or, I don't know, structuring a new internal department or just trying to navigate the daily dynamics of your workplace, we are all so heavily conditioned to think in terms of transactions.
Right. The whole you do this, I do that mindset.
Exactly. The whole corporate world practically runs on, I do this specific task for you, and you give me that specific compensation in return.
It's just a vending machine mentality.
It is. But transitioning from that transactional mindset into a genuine partnership mindset changes absolutely everything. It alters how you handle internal conflict, how you measure actual success rather than just output, and ultimately the quality of what you put out into the world.
So the essay starts by basically attacking the very foundation of how most of us organize our work, like the trap of strict assignments.
The classic scope of work.
Exactly. Antonio points out that in almost all traditional collaborations, the relationship is built entirely on clearly defined tasks. You establish short-term goals, you draw a hard box around the scope, and you sign a contract.
Which, to be fair, makes logical sense for certain predictable, repeatable actions.
Sure, yeah.
If the task is highly limited and the goal is strictly short-term, a rigid assignment works perfectly fine. But Intunio has found this traditional approach completely insufficient for digital products, or really any modern knowledge work that is meant to live, breathe, and evolve over time in a changing market.
I was trying to visualize this transactional dynamic while reading, and, well, the old analogy is ordering in a restaurant. You order a steak, they cook it, transaction complete.
Right, clean and simple.
But that doesn't really capture the complexity of a long-term project at all. It actually feels more like hiring a personal trainer, but with a terrible contract.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Right. If I hire a trainer and the strict boundary is you are just here to count my reps and hand me weights, that's a purely transactional relationship.
It's just fulfilling the order.
Exactly. So if I decide I want to lift 300 pounds on my very first day with completely terrible form, a strictly transactional trainer just loads up the bar, counts my reps, and watches my spine snap. Because, hey, counting reps was the deliverable.
Yeah, that is a much more accurate illustration of the danger here. The transactional trainer doesn't care about your holistic health. They only care about fulfilling the specific terms of the assignment.
Which is terrifying when you think about applying that to a million-dollar project.
What's fascinating here is how Intunio addresses the alternative. Tobias argues that for long-lasting complex products, responsibility simply cannot be tied to rigid roles.
Right.
The boundary between the client and the supplier doesn't just need to blur, it actually needs to fade almost entirely.
But let me push back on that for a second, because fading boundaries usually trigger massive alarm bells for anyone who has ever managed a budget.
Oh, absolutely. The word scoop creep comes to mind.
Exactly. Isn't that rigid boundary exactly what keeps projects from descending into total chaos? Like if I hire an agency or a contractor, or even if I'm just collaborating with another department in my own company, I want them to do the job we agreed upon.
That's a very natural defense mechanism.
If we start fading the lines, doesn't that just invite massive scope creep? How do you maintain any kind of accountability if nobody knows who is strictly supposed to be doing what?
Well, that fear of chaos is exactly why companies default to rigid contracts in the first place. But the mechanism of a fading boundary isn't about removing accountability, it's about shifting what you are accountable for.
Okay, shifting it to what exactly?
So in a traditional model, you are accountable for an output, delivering the code, finishing the design, hitting the Tuesday deadline. But in a fading boundary model, both sides become jointly accountable for the outcome.
Output versus outcome.
Exactly.
So it's basically the difference between malicious compliance, like just building exactly what the client asked for, even if you know it's a terrible idea,
Yeah.
and actual stewardship of the product.
Precisely. To go back to your personal trainer analogy, a trainer acting as a true partner will literally slap the heavyweight out of your hand and say, no, we aren't doing that today. We are working on your mobility.
Because the goal is health, not the rep count.
Right. Because your goal is long-term health, not a specific number on the bar. The supplier stops saying, well, the client asked for this feature, so I'll just build it, and starts saying, we are building this product together, so let's analyze if this feature actually serves the end user.
Which changes the entire conversation.
It really does. It is a fundamental shift from executing a predetermined task to stewarding a living outcome.
And that shift from executing tasks to stewarding outcomes
Yeah.
takes us right out of the what we are building and forces us to look entirely at the how.
Because the what is always going to change anyway.
Exactly, because if you tear down that old client-supplier wall, you have to replace it with a completely new operational framework. Otherwise, it really is just chaos.
And this is where Intunio makes a crucial distinction for anyone trying to actually implement this. Working in a partnership is not defined by the duration of the contract.
That's such an important point.
It really is. You don't magically become partners just because you've been working together for 3 years. It is strictly defined by how you operate day to day.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Tobias notes that this how means staying incredibly close to the actual teams and the decision-making process.
Proximity is key.
But the specific mechanism that stood out to me is that this true partnership means actively contributing perspectives, even when they fall completely outside your original domain or task.
That is the linchpin of the entire philosophy. And let's be honest, it is incredibly difficult to execute in reality.
Oh, it goes against every corporate survival instinct we have.
Think about the psychological vulnerability and just the sheer professional courage it takes to step outside your defined role. If you are hired specifically as a back-end developer, your natural self-protective instinct is to stay in your code.
Keep your head down, do your tickets.
Right. But what happens if you spot a glaring flaw in the user interface design? Or you realize the marketing strategy fundamentally misunderstands the product's actual capabilities?
In a transactional, rigid boundary relationship, you stay completely quiet.
Exactly. You think, not my job, not my problem.
Because speaking up in that environment usually gets you punished. I mean, if a junior developer critiques a senior client's vision or steps on the turns of the lead designer, that sounds like a fast track to a toxic workplace.
You're stepping out of line?
Yeah, you risk annoying the client, delaying the timeline, and making enemies. So the safest bet is just to keep your mouth shut.
Exactly. The corporate structure often actively incentivizes silence. But in the partnership model Intunio describes, you have a shared collective commitment to the final product.
You're all in the same boat.
You are. And you are expected to have the courage to speak up when a process needs to be simplified, or when priorities need to be completely rearranged, or when a feature just needs more time to be tested.
You contribute that outside perspective because you share responsibility for the entire ecosystem of the product, not just your little technical slice of it.
Exactly. It creates a sort of holistic defense mechanism for the project.
I love that phrase, holistic defense mechanism. Instead of having one person responsible for security, one for design, and one for budget, operating in silos, you have multiple different brains, with all their varied expertise, looking out for the health of the entire organism.
It does work beautifully when it clicks, but, we have to acknowledge the reality of working that way.
It's not always pretty.
Not at all. Stepping out of your lane and challenging a client's core idea inherently causes interpersonal friction. It absolutely slows down the immediate process to have these debates.
Which begs the question, how does a team actually survive that kind of constant friction without completely imploding?
That's the million-dollar question.
If every decision is open to cross-departmental critique, that could easily devolve into just endless arguing. There has to be an underlying mechanism that prevents the friction from destroying the relationship.
And according to the essay, that mechanism is trust.
But not just trust as a poster on the break room wall.
Right. Trust isn't just a nice cultural buzzword here. It is the absolute operational currency of this working model.
The essay makes a very specific mechanical connection there. It explicitly links trust to both velocity and safety.
Which seem like opposites at first glance.
Yeah. But when the people on a team actually trust each other, decisions are made significantly faster. Course corrections become practically seamless. And exploring new, potentially risky paths feels psychologically safe.
Because nobody's going to throw you under the bus if it fails.
So what does this all mean? I was visualizing it like navigating a ship in a storm.
Oh, that's a really fitting comparison. How does the trust translate to velocity in that storm scenario?
Well, if you're the captain and you have spent time building implicit trust with your crew, you can pivot that ship instantly when you see a rogue wave approaching.
No hesitation.
Right. You yell, "Turn port," and the crew just executes the maneuver. They don't stop to ask for a risk assessment matrix. They don't demand a revised contract before touching the wheel.
They trust your call.
But if that trust doesn't exist, you end up spending the entire storm down in the cabin arguing over the map. You're trying to document whose fault it is that you're in the storm to begin with, purely to protect yourselves from liability.
And meanwhile, the ship is taking on water.
Exactly. The administrative drag literally sinks the ship.
That administrative drag is the defining characteristic of low-trust environments. Every single decision has to be endlessly validated, heavily documented, and defensive.
Covering your own back.
Right. Trust removes that friction entirely. But establishing that trust requires actions that often feel deeply counterintuitive to traditional business practices.
And that brings us to the most counterintuitive point in Tobias's essay. I really have to challenge the mechanics of this one because it sounds crazy at first.
Oh, I know the point you're talking about.
He states that partnership shows up through the willingness to do what benefits the product, even when that means doing less.
Doing less. The ultimate corporate taboo.
Okay, let's just pause there and look at the reality of client management. How on earth do you actually convince a paying client that doing less is a good thing?
It's a very tough sell.
If I hire a studio and I secure a $500,000 budget for 10 specific features, and the studio comes back and says, actually, in the spirit of partnership, we're only going to build 6, my immediate visceral reaction is going to be that they are cutting corners and I am getting ripped off.
Naturally.
How do you survive that conversation?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, your reaction highlights exactly why the old client-supplier boundary has to fade before this conversation can even happen.
Because if the boundary's still there, it's just a broken contract.
In a transactional relationship, you are absolutely right. Doing less looks exactly like a breach of contract. It looks like sheer laziness.
You owe me 4 more features.
Exactly. But when you have established that shared stewardship of the outcome we talked about, doing less is recognized for what it actually is.
Which is what?
A highly strategic, often data-driven choice to protect the product.
But how do you execute that conversation without getting fired? You can't just walk into a boardroom and say, we're doing less because we feel like it.
No, you don't. You bring undeniable transparency into how the trade-offs are calculated. You don't secretly do less behind their back. You sit down together, you look at the landscape, and you show the client the actual cost of their request.
Showing your work, basically.
Right. You might bring user testing data that shows features 7, 8, and 9 are actually confusing the test group. You bring technical data showing that building those extra features will add, say, 400 hours of technical debt and maintenance over the next 2 years.
All for a feature that maybe 2% of users will actually adopt.
Exactly.
So the transparency itself essentially becomes the deliverable. You are delivering the insight that prevents a massively costly mistake.
You are proving that you care more about the long-term viability of the product than you do about just billing them for more hours to build bloated, useless features.
Which is incredibly rare.
It is. It is incredibly hard to look a client in the eye and say, your idea is going to clutter the user experience and dilute the core value of what we are building. We need to cut it.
That takes guts.
But in a true partnership, you share responsibility for the quality, not just the volume of output. Doing less and backing it up with transparent data is the ultimate proof that you are acting as a partner, not just a vendor.
That completely flips the incentive structure. Instead of being incentivized to just say yes to everything to keep the billing hours high, you are incentivized to rigorously defend the core purpose of the project.
You become a guardian of the product.
It's protecting the product's long-term value over the short-term gratification of kicking a box on a spreadsheet.
And because these strategic choices, like aggressively doing less, or pausing development to simplify a messy code base, or course correcting based on subtle shifts in user data, because these actions are so methodical and subtle, we arrive at Intunio's final observation.
And it is perhaps the most grounding observation about what this looks like in practice. It is a stark contrast to what the tech industry usually sells us.
Definitely.
I want to quote Tobias directly from the text here because it's so definitive. He writes, regarding the day-to-day reality of this partnership, quote, "It is rarely spectacular."
Rarely spectacular. This raises an important question for you, listening to this right now, about the culture of your own workplace.
Oh yeah. Think about what we actually celebrate.
We are deeply, almost pathologically conditioned by modern corporate culture to celebrate the spectacular. We heavily incentivize the massive, flashy moments.
But we want the cinematic eureka moments, the
Yeah.
massive keynote presentations. We throw huge office parties for the big launch.
Champagne in the break room.
Right, we give out company awards for deploying a massive update.
Exactly. We reward the ribbon-cutting ceremonies because they are highly visible and, frankly, they look fantastic on a resume.
Everyone loves a ribbon cutting.
But Intunio is arguing that the actual enduring value of a product is almost never built in those spectacular moments. Value is built quietly.
In the background.
Right. It is built in the highly mundane, routine Tuesday morning meetings where a cross-functional team is simply willing to think together. It's built when they gently challenge each other's assumptions and adapt to changing market conditions without pointing fingers or demanding a contract renegotiation.
It really highlights the difference between construction and gardening.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Construction is inherently spectacular. You swing a massive wrecking ball, you pour thousands of tons of concrete, you erect a skyscraper, boom, it's done.
And then you move on to the next site.
Right. The deliverable is met, you cut the ribbon, and the construction crew walks away forever. But building a digital product or sustaining any long-term initiative is actually gardening.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the shift in mindset.
Because with gardening, planting the initial seeds is just the very beginning. The real compounding value is the entirely unspectacular reality of watering the soil, pulling weeds, pruning branches, and adjusting to unpredictable weather day after day, year after year.
It's constant stewardship.
Yeah, you don't throw a catered office party every time you pull a single weed. It's invisible work to the outside world. But if you stop pulling those weeds, if you stop the unspectacular maintenance, the entire garden inevitably dies.
Which perfectly illustrates why the traditional rigid delivery model fails for these types of projects.
It just doesn't fit the reality of the work.
You cannot hire a gardener on a strict fixed bid contract to deliver a fully mature, thriving garden by next Tuesday and then have them walk away permanently.
It's absurd when you frame it like that.
The ecosystem requires an ongoing adaptive relationship with the soil. It requires continuity in the team so they actually learn the specific rhythms and vulnerabilities of that specific garden.
So let's take a step back and look at the entire journey we've just mapped out from Intunio's philosophy.
It's been quite a ride.
We started by looking at a ubiquitous problem projects that technically meet every single requirement, but still manage to fail in practice. And we use that paradox to examine why the traditional rigid wall between a client and a supplier is so destructive for long-term work.
The whole outputs versus outcomes debate.
Right. We found that true partnership isn't measured by the length of a contract, but by a shared holistic responsibility for the outcome. It demands the vulnerability to step completely outside your assigned role, to advocate for the overall health of the product.
And we also dissected how trust acts as the operational currency that makes this entire framework actually function.
The fuel for the whole engine.
Without it, you drown in administrative drag. With it, you gain the agility and the professional courage to make difficult, data-driven decisions, like transparently proving to a client that doing less is actually the most strategic move they can make.
And finally, we grounded all of this in the reality that the most resilient, long-lasting collaborations aren't built on flashy, explosive deliveries. They're cultivated through small, unspectacular, consistent choices made by people who are committed to the ongoing maintenance of the work.
Which brings us to a final underlying tension in this entire philosophy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Intunio explicitly states that this kind of partnership is not something you can just declare up front in a kickoff meeting. It only grows organically, step by step, through how you work together.
You have to earn it.
Exactly. But that leaves you with a rather difficult dynamic to consider as you evaluate your own teams. If a true partnership is entirely reliant on these quiet, subtle bonds of trust forged between specific individuals over time, what actually happens to the product when a key member of that team inevitably leaves?
Oh, wow. That's a scary thought.
Right. Can that deeply ingrained trust simply be transferred to a new hire through a handover document? Or does the entire partnership secretly reset to zero the moment the human dynamic changes?
That is a genuinely difficult problem to navigate, because it implies that the real value isn't held in the code or the contract or the company name, but in the specific human relationships managing it.
Something to mull over before your next stand-up meeting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take these concepts with you into your next cross-departmental meeting or the next time you are staring at a spreadsheet full of green check marks, wondering why the project still feels completely off track. Remember, the final deliverable is just the beginning. The way you work together is where the actual value survives.